The first time I noticed it, I didn't think it was strange. That's probably the part I keep coming back to now. Not the ending. Not the night I finally looked inside. Not even the things I found afterward. The part that stays with me is how easy it was, in the beginning, to explain everything away. Because that's how these things usually start in real life. Not with a scream. Not with a figure in the window. Not with something dramatic enough to force your brain to believe it immediately. It starts with one small thing that doesn't fit. Then another. Then enough time passes that the pattern becomes familiar before it becomes frightening. And by the time you finally admit to yourself that something is wrong, you're already deeper into it than you ever meant to be. A few years ago, I rented the upstairs half of a split-level house in a quiet neighborhood just outside a small town. It wasn't exactly rural, but it wasn't suburban in the neat, polished way people imagine either. It was the kind of neighborhood that had probably looked nicer 15 years earlier. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, just a little worn down around the edges. There were maybe 12 houses on the street. Most of them older, all built around the same time. Low roofs, narrow driveways, chain-link fences in some yards. Porches people still actually used in the summer. The kind of place where people noticed each other's routines without thinking about it. You knew who left for work early. You knew who got too many packages. You knew who mowed their lawn too often. You knew which dog barked at the mail truck every day. You knew when someone new moved in, and you definitely knew when a house sat empty. The house directly across from mine had been empty since before I moved there. That much I knew right away. It wasn't abandoned exactly. That word gives the wrong picture. It wasn't falling apart. The grass got cut every couple of weeks. The mailbox was emptied often enough that nothing overflowed. In winter, someone shoveled the walkway after snow, but no one lived there. No lights on at night. No car in the driveway. No curtains shifting. No trash cans put out regularly. Nothing that suggested an ordinary life was happening inside. When I asked my landlord about it one day, mostly just making conversation, he told me the elderly woman who owned it had died a few years earlier, and the family had been sorting things out ever since. That sounded believable to me. Anyone who's dealt with family property knows sorting things out can mean almost anything: probate, arguments, a son out of state, a daughter who can't afford repairs, a house frozen between generations because nobody wants to make the final decision. So I never thought much about it after that. At least not at first. A man lived 2 houses down from me on the same side of the street. Older, maybe late 60s or early 70s. Always wore a cap when he was outside. Kept his yard neat. Waved when people waved first, the kind of neighbor you don't really know, but whose habits become part of the street. I saw him often enough because he walked almost every afternoon at around the same time, rain or shine, unless the weather was really bad. He'd go to the small grocery store near the main road, come back with a couple of bags, and disappear into his house. Normal. That was why it took me so long to notice that on Thursdays he didn't bring the groceries into his own house. Street. Again, the first time I noticed it, I didn't think it was strange. I was working from home that day, sitting near the front window because the Wi-Fi signal was stronger there. I saw him walk up the front path of the empty house carrying 2 plastic grocery bags. He set them down by the front door, adjusted one of them so it wouldn't tip over. Then stood there for a second like he was waiting. After maybe 10 seconds, he knocked once, not loud, not trying to get anyone's attention, more like a polite signal. Then he turned around and left. That was it. I remember thinking maybe a family member was staying there temporarily. Or maybe someone was renovating inside. Or maybe he was helping an older relative who just didn't go out much. There are 100 normal explanations for groceries at a front door. I didn't think about it again until the next Thursday. Same time, same man, same 2 grocery bags, same front path, same knock, and that's when I felt the first little shift in my head, because the house still looked empty. I mean really empty, not quiet, not keeping to themselves. Empty. No movement inside. No lights. No sign of anyone coming or going. I watched from my window longer that time. No one opened the door. No one pulled the bags inside. He didn't speak to anyone. He just knocked once, turned, and walked home. I checked later that evening when I took my trash out. The bags were gone. That part bothered me more than it should have. Not because it was scary, because it removed the easiest explanation. If the bags had still been sitting there, I could have told myself he forgot them, or someone wasn't home, or I'd misunderstood what I was seeing, but they were gone, which meant somebody took them, or he came back and got them later without me noticing. That became my explanation. I didn't love it, but it was enough. Then it kept happening. Every Thursday. Always sometime between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. Always 2 grocery bags, sometimes 3. Always the same walk up the path. Always one knock, never any visible response. And every single time, by evening, the bags were gone. After about a month, I started timing it without meaning to. That's what happens when you work from home too much and live alone. Other people's habits become landmarks in your day. Thursday, 4:30 a.m. There he goes again. Samey house, samey bags. I started paying attention to what was inside them. Not in a creepy, digging through trash way. Just from the distance of my window when the bags were thin enough to show shapes: bread, canned soup, milk, bananas. Paper towels once, frozen meals in insulated bags, bottled water. Eggs, ordinary groceries. Not flowers, not supplies for repairs, not cleaning products, food. That detail matters, because food implies a person. Somebody has to eat it, and once that thought settled into my head, I found it harder to ignore the fact that nobody on the street ever seemed to see a person at that house. Not ever. I'm not saying I watched the place constantly. I had a job, I had a life, but when you live across from a house long enough, you notice the absence of ordinary things. No porch light switching on at dusk. No package deliveries sitting too long or disappearing too fast. No windows cracked open in summer, no television glow. No car pulling in late. Nothing, and still, every Thursday, the groceries disappeared. A couple of months after I moved in, I brought it up casually to the woman living downstairs from me. She was older than me, maybe in her 50s, and had been renting there for years. She knew the street much better than I did. I asked, "Do you know who lives across the street?" She looked at me in a way that made me think I'd phrased it wrong. Then she said nobody. I told her about the groceries. She shrugged at first and said the old man had been bringing things over there for a long time. I asked who for. She just said, "That's his business." The way she said it didn't sound gossipy or annoyed. It sounded shut down, like a conversation she had already decided not to have. That should have been enough to make me leave it alone. Instead, it made me more curious. Because if there's one thing that reliably makes ordinary behavior feel unsettling, it's when everyone around it acts like it's both known and off limits. After that, I started noticing smaller things. The old man didn't only bring groceries. Sometimes he brought pharmacy bags, sometimes paper-wrapped bundles from the bakery near the main road. On say near winter, I saw him carrying a bag of oranges and a carton of soup containers like someone had ordered takeout. Always the same pattern. Walk up, set bags down, knock once. Wait, leave. And always, later, the bags disappeared. Then one Thursday, the groceries didn't disappear. That was the first time I felt real unease. It was raining that day, hard enough that everything outside looked gray and flat through the window. The old man came over anyway, carrying the bags under his coat as best he could. He set them down, knocked, waited, then went home. By 6 they were still there, by 7 still there. It was dark by then, and the porch light at the empty house never came on, because it never came on for anything. At some point around 8, I looked again and saw one of the paper bags had tipped over. A box of crackers and a can had fallen out onto the porch and were getting wet. That bothered me enough that I almost went over myself. I didn't, but I thought about it. Around 9:30, I checked one last time before bed. The groceries were gone. The porch was empty, and I remember standing there in the dark by my own window, staring across the street, trying to understand why that unsettled me so much. Because if someone had simply come out and taken them in, that was normal, that was exactly what should have happened. But I had looked away for maybe 20 minutes. That was all. And in that time, in a rainstorm, someone had taken in the bags without a porch light, without a visible door opening, without me seeing even a shadow move. I told myself I missed it. Obviously I missed it. What else was I supposed to think? Still, from then on I found it harder to look at the house without feeling like I was one step behind something. Not in a supernatural way, not then. Just in the frustrating way you feel when you know a simple explanation exists, but somehow you keep failing to catch it in action. A week later I saw the old man at the grocery store. This was the first time I'd been close enough to him to speak for more than a passing hello. We ended up in the same checkout line, and because I'd spent weeks watching him carry food to that house, I found myself looking at what he was buying. It was almost exactly what I expected: soup, bread, tea, applesauce, plain crackers, soft fruit, milk, batteries, paper towels. The kind of shopping that looked less like someone buying for themselves and more like someone caring for someone who didn't leave the house much. He noticed me noticing and gave a polite little nod. I said something easy, something like, "Looks like we had the same idea coming before the weather." He smiled a little, not unfriendly. Then I asked, as casually as I could, "You helping someone across the street?" I thought he might ignore the question, or say yes and leave it at that. Instead, he looked at me for a second too long and said, "She doesn't like going out." That was the first solid answer I got. It should have reassured me, instead it made things worse. Because now, there was a person attached to the house, but nothing else about the situation became more normal. If anything, it became less normal. I said, "I didn't realize anyone was living there," and he answered, "Not living exactly." Then it was his turn to pay, and he ended the conversation without seeming rude about it. That sentence stayed with me for days. Not living exactly. I kept turning it over in my mind, trying to make it harmless. Maybe he meant staying there temporarily. Maybe he meant the person was ill. Maybe he meant an elderly relative had the house but spent most of the time in care and only came back now and then. There were explanations. There were always explanations. Then, winter started settling in. Not heavy snow yet, but that gray stretch when everything looks cold even before it freezes. The street got quieter. People moved faster from car to door. Curtains closed earlier. And still, every Thursday, the groceries came. Around that time, I started noticing another detail. The old man always knocked, but he never used the doorbell. That sounds small, but when you watch someone repeat a ritual long enough, the parts they avoid become as noticeable as the parts they do. There was a doorbell beside the frame. I could see it clearly from my window. He never touched it. Always one knock, once, wait, leave, never more. That became one of those little details that sat in the back of my mind and made the whole thing feel stranger without offering any real answer. Then came the night I saw the light. It was just after 2 a.m., and I'd gotten up for water. I happened to glance out the kitchen window as I passed through, and there, across the street, for the first time since I'd moved in, I saw a light on inside the empty house, not bright. Not a room fully lit. Just a small warm light from what looked like the back part of the house. Low enough that I thought at first it might be a lamp. I stood there for a long time staring at it. At that hour, a light should have comforted me. It should have settled the question. See, someone is in there. Instead, it made my chest tighten, because I had spent months looking at that house dark. And something about seeing only one low light in one room at 2 in the morning made it feel less occupied and more secretive. I checked again 10 minutes later. The light was off. The next day I asked the woman downstairs if she had ever actually seen the person the old man was bringing groceries to. She was in the yard when I asked, pulling dead leaves out of a flower bed that had mostly given up for the season. She kept working while I talked. Then she said, "You should stop paying attention to that house." Not angry, not even sharp, just tired. I asked why. She said, "Because nothing good comes from people deciding they need to know everything on a street like this." I said, "That doesn't answer the question." She straightened up, brushed dirt from her gloves, and finally looked at me. Then she said, "He started after the old woman died." That was the first sentence anyone gave me that actually changed the shape of the whole thing. I asked what she meant. She hesitated, then said the woman who owned the house had lived there alone for years and had gotten increasingly strange near the end. Not dangerous. Just isolated. Curtains always closed. Rarely answered the door. Had groceries delivered at one point, then stopped. Spoke mostly to the old man from down the street and almost nobody else. When she died, according to the downstairs neighbor, her family came, sorted through some things, took what they wanted, and left the house in limbo. A few months later, the old man started bringing groceries. I asked, "For who?" She went back to the flower bed and said, "That's exactly the kind of question you should leave alone." At that point, I wish I could tell you I dropped it. I didn't, because now it was no longer just a weird act of kindness toward a hidden relative. Now it sounded like a ritual that began after the house became empty. That changed everything. After that, Thursdays stopped feeling quirky and started feeling tense. I would catch myself looking out the window more often in the afternoon, waiting for the same routine to happen, almost hoping it wouldn't. But it always did. And now that I knew it started after the woman died, every part of the ritual felt loaded. The food choices. The single knock, the refusal to use the bell. The way he waited a few seconds as if listening for something. the way he never looked around. Then, a few weeks later, I finally saw the front door open, not while he was there. Later, it was just after dusk, and I was taking the trash out. By then the streetlights had come on, and the empty house sat in that dim in-between glow, where everything looks flatter than it does in full dark. As I was dragging the bin to the curb, I happened to glance across the street. The front door of the empty house was standing open, only a few inches, no light inside, no person visible. Just open. I froze, because even though that's a small thing, I knew immediately that I had never once seen that door open before. Not even when the family had supposedly been sorting things out. Not once. I stayed outside longer than I needed to, pretending to adjust the lid on the bin, watching. Nothing happened. No one came out, no one went in. No sound. Then, very slowly, the door closed. I didn't see a hand. I didn't see movement in the gap, it just drew shut. That was the first night I seriously considered calling someone. Not the police exactly. Because what was I supposed to say? My neighbor brings groceries to a house I thought was empty. And now I saw the door move. But maybe the landlord. Maybe the property company. Maybe someone connected to the family. I didn't do it, partly because I still had no evidence of anything actually wrong, partly because I felt ridiculous, and partly because, if I'm honest, I didn't want to be the outsider on the street who overreacted to some private arrangement everyone else understood. That's another reason realistic horror works the way it does. Social embarrassment keeps people quiet longer than fear does. The next Thursday, I decided I was going to watch from outside instead of the window. Nothing dramatic. I just happened to be walking back from my car when the old man came down the street with the grocery bags, and instead of going inside, I stayed by the porch and acted like I was on my phone. He crossed the street, walked up to the empty house, set the bags down, knocked once, and waited. Up close, the pause felt longer than it had from the window. Maybe 15 seconds. Maybe 20. Long enough to feel like he expected an answer. Not long enough to insist on one. Then he turned, and almost walked right past me on his way back. I said, "Can I help you carry anything next time?" It was a stupid thing to say, but I didn't know how else to start. He stopped, not startled, not caught, just stopped. Then he said, "Number it has to be me." I asked why. He looked back at the house, then at me, and said, "Because she knows me." Again, she. Always she. I said, trying to sound light, I didn't know anyone was staying there. He gave me a look I still remember because it wasn't hostile, it was pitying. Then he said, "That depends what you mean by staying." And walked away. I stood there on my own porch afterward, feeling colder than I should have. Because this was no longer just odd behavior. Now there were patterns in his language. Not living exactly depends what you mean by staying, she knows. That wasn't how people talked about an elderly shut-in. It wasn't how they talked about grief either. It was how people talked when they had built a private logic around something they did not expect other people to understand. Not long after that, I made the mistake of mentioning it to a friend. We were having a drink after work one evening, and I told him the whole story like it was a neighborhood mystery. He laughed in the exact way I probably would have laughed if someone else told me the same thing. He said the old man was probably just lonely, or mentally slipping, or bringing groceries to the memory of the old woman because that's how he dealt with her death. And for a while, I held on to that explanation as hard as I could, because it was sad, but it was normal sad. An old man with grief rituals, a neighborhood that let him do it, a house becoming a container for a habit he couldn't stop. That made sense, until I saw inside. It happened by accident. There was a windstorm one night in early spring, not a huge one, but strong enough to knock over bins, rattle branches loose, and send trash skittering down the street. Around midnight, I heard something hit our porch hard enough to wake me. The downstairs neighbor had already gone away for the weekend, so I was the only one home. I got up, checked the front, and found one of the recycling bins tipped into the fence. While I was out there dragging it back, I looked across the street. The front door of the empty house was open again. Wider this time, maybe 1.5 feet. The wind was catching it slightly, not enough to slam, just enough to make it tremble against the frame, and inside, from where I stood, I could see a line of the hallway. That should not have mattered as much as it did, but after all those months of seeing only the outside, that narrow slice of interior space felt wrong in a very immediate way. Not because I saw something impossible, because I saw enough to know someone had been using the house. There were grocery bags stacked against the wall just inside the hall, not one or two. A lot. Paper bags, plastic bags, flattened boxes, a few canned goods loose near the baseboard. The entryway looked less like a home and more like a place where deliveries had been accumulating. I stood there in the street far longer than I should have, staring into that crack of darkness. Then the hallway light switched on. Just like that, no footsteps first, no figure moving. Just a pale yellow light flooding the hall. I backed up without thinking, and in that moment, from where I stood, I saw the outline of someone at the far end of the hall, not close enough to make out details. Just a person-shaped stillness. Then the front door shut, hard. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had talked myself into the most harmless version possible. Simone and the family had access. Simone had been sorting donations or supplies. I saw a person because there was, in fact, a real person there. But that explanation didn't survive the weekend, because on Saturday morning I saw the old man across the street loading groceries into his trunk, more than usual. Like he was preparing for a longer stop. He drove to the empty house instead of walking, opened the trunk, carried multiple bags to the porch, and this time, instead of leaving them outside, he went in. That was new. He closed the door behind him. I watched the house for over an hour. He never came back out, at least not while I was watching. That should have settled it. Somebody had a key. Somebody entered the house. Normal, except by then, normal no longer fit as well as it should have, because if he could go inside any time, why had he spent months leaving the groceries at the door? Why the knock? Why the wait? Why never ring the bell? Why always Thursdays? Why act like the person inside had to accept the delivery rather than simply receiving it? And why had nobody on the street ever once referred to an actual living occupant? The answer came in pieces after that. The first piece was the mail. A week later, I was walking back from my car when I saw the mail carrier stop at the empty house. She opened the box, pulled out a small stack, then stopped and frowned. She took a red slip from her pouch, wrote something on it, and left it tucked partly inside the box. That evening, I crossed over after dark and looked. I know I shouldn't have, but by then curiosity had taken over whatever good judgment I had left. The red slip was a forwarding notice, not active mail delivery, forwarding. Meaning, the mail for the dead woman had officially been rerouted somewhere else. No signature. That line made me feel sick immediately, though I couldn't fully explain why. Maybe because it sounded like permission extended past death. Maybe because it sounded like a promise nobody else would understand. Maybe because I already knew, somehow, that it was him. After that, I started noticing that the groceries weren't always disappearing fully. Sometimes a day later, I'd see old peels or empty cans in the trash bins out back of the empty house. Not put out at the curb, just inside the side gate, fresh. That meant someone was eating there, or at least opening food there. And if it was the old man doing it himself as part of some ritual, why hide it behind the house instead of using his own trash? That question bothered me almost more than anything else. Because grief rituals are one thing. Hidden waste is another. Hidden waste suggests maintenance. Secrecy, continuation. It suggests somebody trying to preserve the illusion that a house has no life while quietly servicing whatever life remains inside it. I lasted another 2 weeks before I finally went over. It was a Thursday. Of course it was. I watched him bring the groceries, knock once, wait, and leave. Then I waited 15 minutes. Then 20. Then I crossed the street. At the porch, everything felt smaller than it did from my window. The door paint was peeling at the bottom. The bags were ordinary grocery store bags, slightly damp from the air. I could smell bananas and laundry detergent. Nothing about it felt supernatural. Just private. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Then, I tried the doorknob. Unlocked. That was the moment I should have walked away. Instead, I opened the door. The smell hit me first, not rot. Not anything obvious. That question bothered me almost more than anything else. Because grief rituals are one thing, hidden waste is another. Hidden waste suggests maintenance, secrecy. Continuation, it suggests somebody trying to preserve the illusion that a house has no life while quietly servicing whatever life remains inside it. I lasted another 2 weeks before I finally went over. It was a Thursday, of course it was. I watched him bring the groceries, knock once, wait, and leave. Then I waited 15 minutes. Then 20, then I crossed the street. At the porch, everything felt smaller than it did from my window. The door paint was peeling at the bottom. The bags were ordinary grocery store bags, slightly damp from the air. I could smell bananas and laundry detergent. Nothing about it felt supernatural, just private. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. Then I tried the doorknob. Unlocked. That was the moment I should have walked away. Instead, I opened the door. The smell hit me first. Not rot. Not anything obvious than another soft movement, not heavy, not rushing, just enough to tell me I was not alone in that house. I backed toward the front door immediately, and from the upstairs landing, in a voice so weak I almost thought I imagined it, a woman said, "Did he send enough this time?" That's what she said, not "Who are you?" Not "What are you doing here?" Did he send enough this time? I couldn't see her clearly from where I stood, just a shape at the top of the stairs in the dimness. I said the first thing that came into my head, which was, "I'm sorry, I thought no one lived here." There was a long pause. Then she said, "Neither did they," and I left. I left immediately. I don't remember exactly how fast I got across the street, only that by the time I was back inside my own place, my hands were shaking so hard I spilled water trying to fill a glass. Because now the story had changed again. There was a woman in the house. Living there, staying there, hiding there. I still didn't know, but she was real. Her voice was real, and the old man was not hallucinating a dead neighbor, at least not entirely. That should have been the point where everything got simpler. Instead, it became more disturbing. Because if there was a real woman upstairs, then a whole new set of questions opened up. Who was she? Why didn't anyone acknowledge her? Why no mail? Why no lights? Why no car? Why did the old man act like she was both present and not alive in any ordinary sense? And why did the downstairs neighbor say he started bringing groceries only after the old woman died? I didn't get the answer all at once. I got it from the downstairs neighbor 2 nights later, after I finally told her I had gone inside. That made her furious in a way I hadn't seen before, not shocked, not scared, angry. She said I had no business going into that house. I said there was a woman in there. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time before saying, "I knew there would be one eventually." Then she told me what she knew, not everything, but enough. The woman upstairs in that house was the old woman's sister, not legally listed on anything, not known to most of the street because she had been unwell for years and had apparently spent long stretches moving between relatives, care facilities, and periods of vanishing from one place to another. According to the downstairs neighbor, when the homeowner died, the family came and cleaned out part of the house, assuming the sister was elsewhere. I don't remember exactly how fast I got across the street, only that by the time I was back inside my own place, my hands were shaking so hard I spilled water trying to fill a glass. Because now the story had changed again. There was a woman in the house. Living there, staying there, hiding there. I still didn't know, but she was real. Her voice was real, and the old man was not hallucinating a dead neighbor, at least not entirely. That should have been the point where everything got simpler. Instead, it became more disturbing. Because if there was a real woman upstairs, then a whole new set of questions opened up. Who was she? Why didn't anyone acknowledge her? Why no mail? Why no lights? Why no car? Why did the old man act like she was both present and not alive in any ordinary sense? And why did the downstairs neighbor say he started bringing groceries only after the old woman died? I didn't get the answer all at once. I got it from the downstairs neighbor 2 nights later, after I finally told her I had gone inside. That made her furious in a way I hadn't seen before, not shocked, not scared, angry. She said I had no business going into that house. I said there was a woman in there. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time before saying, "I knew there would be one eventually." Then she told me what she knew, not everything, but enough. The woman upstairs in that house was the old woman's sister, not legally listed on anything, not known to most of the street because she had been unwell for years and had apparently spent long stretches moving between relatives, care facilities, and periods of vanishing from one place to another. According to the downstairs neighbor, when the homeowner died, the family came and cleaned out part of the house, assuming the sister was elsewhere. But she had already come back, or maybe had never fully left. The story was unclear even to her. The old man down the street found her there days after the funeral when he came to check on the property. He knew both women from church years earlier, knew enough to recognize the sister. Knew enough to understand that if authorities got involved, she would likely be removed, institutionalized, or lost in the system. So he started bringing groceries, quietly, regularly. Without telling most people, I asked why nobody just helped properly. The downstairs neighbor gave me a look that answered more than her words did. Then she said, "Because proper help isn't always kind when you're old, confused, undocumented in the right ways, and no one wants legal responsibility. That line stayed with me. Because suddenly the story wasn't a ghost story at all. It was something more realistic, and in a way, worse. A hidden human life maintained by one aging neighbor and tolerated by a street that preferred not to ask too many questions. But that still didn't explain everything. It didn't explain why the old man spoke about her the way he did, why he said, "not living exactly." Why he warned me not to let her see me looking too long, why he treated the whole thing less like charity and more like obligation. He got that answer from him later. The final answer, I mean. And it's the reason this story still bothers me as horror, even though nothing supernatural ever happened. I went to his house the next week and told him I knew there was a woman over there. He didn't seem surprised, just tired. He invited me in, made tea, and after a long silence told me the rest. The sister had not simply come back after the funeral. She had been hidden in that house for years. Not every day, not openly, but often enough. The old woman had been keeping her there on and off when she couldn't manage outside care and didn't trust the family to understand. The sister had episodes, confusion, paranoia, long stretches where she didn't want strangers, didn't want doctors, didn't want to leave. The old woman handled it privately until she died. After that, he found the sister still there in the upstairs room, living off canned food, barely understanding the old woman was gone. He told the family once, indirectly, and they dismissed him. They thought he was confused, or exaggerating, or interfering. So he kept bringing groceries, at first because he thought it would be temporary. Then because weeks passed, then months. Then too much time passed for any clean solution to exist anymore. He said, "Once you've left someone there long enough, every option starts looking cruel." That, to me, was the most horrifying line in the whole story, because it was true. The horror wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a monster. It was a person slipping outside normal systems of care so quietly that eventually everyone nearby adjusted themselves around the fact of her existence rather than force a painful resolution. He knocked once because if she was frightened, too much noise upset her. He never used the bell because she hated it. He left the bags at the door because some days she wouldn't open for him unless he waited outside. He went inside when he had to. He kept doing it because he couldn't bear not to. I asked why. He told me, "Not living exactly." He looked down into his tea for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Because after a certain point she was living more in the old woman's routines than in her own life." That line has stayed with me ever since, because it explained the chair by the window, the careful arrangement of things, the low light at night, the house feeling maintained for someone absent. She had inherited a dead woman's routine and stayed inside it, and the street, whether consciously or not, had let her. I moved out that summer, not dramatically. Just when my lease was up, the sister was still there when I left. The old man was still bringing groceries. The downstairs neighbor was still refusing to discuss it more than necessary. The house still looked empty from the street. I've thought about that a lot over the years, about how many lives exist just outside official recognition, about how neighborhoods quietly absorb things they cannot solve, about how easy it is to mistake absence for emptiness. And that's why I still think of it as horror. Not supernatural horror, real-life horror. The kind where someone can disappear into a house in full view of other people and still go unspoken for years. The kind where kindness and neglect become tangled together so tightly no one can say where one ended and the other began. The kind where a grocery bag on a porch means far more than it should. Because sometimes the scariest thing is not that a house is haunted, it's that it isn't. It's that someone is really there, hungry, hidden, half forgotten. And the world outside has learned to keep functioning anyway. For months, I thought I was watching a neighbor feed a ghost. What I was really watching was a hidden life being sustained one grocery bag at a time.